Dear friends of the ACR, eminent guest speakers, good evening from Rome. On behalf of the chair and the members of the Board of Governors, and as director of the Anglican Center in Rome, I wish to welcome you to tonight's seminar. The theme we are to address should stir our thoughts and hearts, the vision renewed, what is our ecumenical future? I also wish to thank you for being part of the ecumenical endeavor of this place of encounter and dialogue. As you all know, the vision of the ACR is to build up bridges and instill a spirit of openness that encourages sharing of opinion, exchanging of gifts, and the nurturing of friendship. With these resources in hand, we should be able to face the challenges of our time, to mobilize diverse opinions on issues of common interest as they bring richness to our quest for unity. But this is only achieved when mutual respect prevails. The objective of this webinar this evening is to listen to the voices of those who, through their own ecumenical journeys, can offer new insights, new thoughts as we look towards the future. So, I am glad to welcome our speakers on the panel, young thinkers of our time, who will surely inspire us with their contributions. I am quite excited in the sense that I've just had some good conversations with each of them, and I'm sure that this evening's webinar will bear fruits for reflection. They represent a diverse group of people who will offer us new perspectives for the future. May I, on your behalf, warmly thank our speakers for accepting to guide us through as we seek a renewed vision for ecumenism. Now, I am very happy to hand over to our moderator, Reverend Dr. James Hawkey, a member of the Board of Governors of the ACR, to coordinate this event. To you, my dear brother, Canon Jamie.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. As a governor of the centre and as the chair of the UK Friends, I'm canon theologian at Westminster Abbey in London. And it's a huge privilege to simply be the person who, as it were, chairs what is going to be, I think, a fascinating discussion between our four interlocutors and then more broadly with everybody here this evening. The pessimists, of course, say that we are living in an ecumenical winter. But I prefer to say that this is autumn. It's the time of proper harvest. Many of you will know Cardinal Walter Kasper's book, Harvesting the Fruits. That's what we're going to do tonight in the company of four exceptional young ecumenists. With so much agreement on what we think of as first-order theological issues, with mature theological dialogues, now a habit of life between our churches, where might the next stage of the journey take us? What does the path look like? What difference does it make that we now have multilateral consensus texts, a consensus text on ecclesiology from the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, the Church Towards a Common Vision? How might we integrate the genuinely substantial theological agreements we already have with the substantial challenges of new demands whilst walking together? Each of our four speakers will address the question of where our dialogue might take us. What are the most important and tantalizing challenges that face us? What should our priorities be in the next half century? I will introduce our speakers as we progress in turn. Each of them will speak. Then there will be a panel discussion between the four of them, and I shall then open the discussion to the floor. So, as our four panelists speak this evening for themselves and then between each other, please be writing your own questions and comments down, ready to go as soon as we open the floor to the plenary. When we do that, we'll ask you to use the raise hand function on Zoom, or if you would prefer to type your questions into the chat box, either directly to me privately or to everybody. But I'm now going to begin by introducing the first of our speakers, Dr. Doriana Buttigieg is a Catholic theologian from Malta. She's a lecturer in liturgy at the University of Malta, where she also teaches ecumenism with a particular focus on receptive ecumenism, and especially within the Catholic Orthodox dialogue. She is coordinator of the theology course at the Pastoral Formation Institute for the Diocese of Malta, and is a member of the Ecumenical Commission for the Diocese, as well as being involved with RCIA. Doriana, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I thank the Anglican Center in Rome for the opportunity it has given me in order to share my views with you. So, where should the focus in ecumenism lie? I believe that there is already a movement from ecclesiology towards anthropology, and I feel that is very important. I feel this is very pertinent, especially from an ecumenical point of view, because this entails an understanding of the human being as a microcosm of the wider reality of the churches and traditions in dialogue. May I go back to a few years ago, namely 2006, where receptive ecumenism was launched by Paul Murray, which explores, as you might know, the notion of reception. So there, each tradition is empowered with the self-critical thinking and question with regard to what each tradition can learn from the other, rather than what each tradition can teach the other. Is this just a response to a pluralistic worldview, just putting the traditions alongside each other for a pick and choose attitude? This is not the case. What is especially exciting about receptive ecumenism is that it explores the perspective of reception from an interdisciplinary approach. And that is very important, especially with regards humanity's interaction with the other. The different other at times is often viewed with suspicion and fear. And I feel that because sometimes we speak of an ecumenical winter, but maybe if we realize and look at the time span of the ecumenical dialogue, and we look at it against a backdrop of even a millennia of estrangement and separation, we need to understand that the process takes time. Maybe we need to understand that. And the move towards reception in ecumenical dialogue is crucial. But as I said, this cannot be seen as a pluralistic tendency. However, receptive ecumenism explores the notion of reception from an interdisciplinary approach, as I mentioned earlier. And I think the crux of the argument here is understanding the human being. Understanding the human being is key in ecumenical dialogue. What lies behind the facets of fear which is often displayed? We realize that sometimes the doctrinal issues which spearheaded the estrangements between the traditions might not be the same problems today. We also have to realize that each church or ecclesial tradition often evolved in separation. So we must take this complexity in view. But most importantly, we have to understand the deeper implications of humanity. And I feel that this is why ecumenism cannot be disconnected from spirituality, because ever since original sin created a distortion in all things complementary, and this has led human beings to see each other's complementarity as competition. And I think it is very important to deal with this issue. Complementarity and diversity, as I said, have often seen as competition, and this has led to the tendency to remain entrenched in one's own confessional identity. Sometimes this might happen even during conferences where topics are explored and members of the different traditions speak from their own perspective. But sometimes I feel a certain hesitancy in moving forward, maybe fear. Maybe it is more comfortable to remain in one's own position. because that is a sure way, remaining in the niche of comfort, I would say. And this is where humility and conversion come into play. They are very crucial. They need to be taken more seriously, I feel. Rather than being addressed, we speak of conversion, even the special time of Advent, this moment, we speak of being prepared. But I feel it is very important for conversion and humility to permeate our inner selves. I feel that these attitudes are key towards ensuring a more holistic and genuine ecumenical dialogue. Humility and conversion permeate the deepest recesses of ecumenical dialogue. Humility beckons to the need to venture out of one's niche and to be ready to respond to Christ in the face of the other, and it takes great courage. And the other, God also invites the believer to repentance and sanctification. And this is also the beauty of the ecumenical dialogue, I feel, because in the other church and tradition, each church, of course, comprised of the pilgrim church, the pilgrims, we are all pilgrims, sees a mirror of herself. And I feel also that the ecumenical movement, which enables us to learn from the other, is an enduring lesson in humility. I also feel that it would be helpful for traditions to retrace their steps together in reading the lessons of the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the Church Fathers and their very valuable lessons about humility. They managed to arrive at a full understanding of the human being, which has been so valid. Why am I saying this? Because these beckon us to a time of an undivided church. So we all share this in common. So I feel it's very important to retrace our steps to this era. Of course, not to romanticize the era, far from it, but to learn. And also the understanding of ecumenism starting from the anthropological perspective also opens the way towards addressing ecumenism from the grassroots level, a term so often used by Pope Francis. We cannot speak only of doctrinal matters at the hierarchical level. Very soon, I'm also speaking of the liturgical aspect, which I feel is very important in ecumenism. And this is very important prior to arriving at the doctrinal matters. Sometimes the doctrinal aspects are not the main aspects, not that they need to be cast aside, far from that. We have seen a lot of work being done, the bilateral dialogues, but of course we know that we need to move forward. There must also, I feel, I will venture very soon the liturgical aspect, as I said, but I also feel we need to take into consideration, in the light of what I've said earlier, the realization that there is a tension between what humanity in dialogue can achieve and the reality that full unity can happen through God's working. We must look at this tension, who through perfect love can heal the cracks wrought by the various discords among human beings. We must also accept, I feel, in the light of what I mentioned earlier about time, that this unity might not happen in our lifetime. I think it is also an act of humility to acknowledge this, but understanding that we have been instruments towards its happening. I like to reflect a lot about Moses, who led the Israelites out of exile. He is the point of reference for Israel. But at the same time, he was not permitted to enter the promised land, especially if we look at Deuteronomy and Numbers. We need to remember in humility that just as all members of the different traditions, we are in need of conversion. Yet, as I said, we are precious instruments in the pilgrimage of the Church of Christ. And I feel that the relationship between ecumenism and liturgy is very important, because we feel that human beings might meet for worship. It might be easier to meet for worship rather than discuss doctrinal matters. As one theologian said, I'm quoting, members of divided churches find it much easier to pray and witness together than to formulate common dogmatic statements. preaching is translated later into structures of dogma. In worship and witness, we face God and our fellow human beings more directly. In dogmatic statements, however, we are merely talking about, in the proper way maybe, to worship and witness. So that is very important, and liturgy will help us in the way forward. I thank you for listening to me. So that is all from my part for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Doriana. Huge richness there, which we will doubtless come back to as the evening goes on. Thank you so much. I'd like to now invite the Reverend Evans Nyamadzawo, who is ordained in the Church of Christ. He is a lecturer at the Churches of Christ seminaries in Zimbabwe and represents the Churches of Christ in ecumenical bodies. He has a diploma in theology and bachelor's and master's degrees from universities in Nigeria and Zimbabwe, and an MA in ecumenical studies from the Ecumenical Institute at Bossi. He is currently studying interreligious studies at the Angelicum, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. Evans, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and organizing such kind of a rich program that I can have an opportunity to be part of. One thing that I want us to have in the back of our mind as I'll be giving this talk or this presentation is the ultimate goal of ecumenism. It is often agreed that what we seek in ecumenical journey is to attain visible unity, which is seen or expressed in the fellowship of churches, communion with one another. So having that in our mind, the question is, what should be our priorities be? My first point, unfortunately, was taken by Dr. Doriana, which has to do with the approach or the methodology, which is receptive ecumenism, which is like one of the challenges which I have seen in the ecumenical journey has been the issue of truth claim, that all churches or a majority of the churches, they claim that they have all the truth. So basically, adding on to what she had said, the receptive ecumenism bridges up the gap of that truth claim. It's not what you offer on table, what you give to the others, but rather it's what you take from other churches. So when you are discussing with others, it's not about you. Like Dr. Paul Moreau, he says that he contends that the bilateral and multilateral dialogues, if taken in isolation, are not capable of delivering the self-critical openness to practical conversation, growth, and development. So rather here, it gives us the potential to have fresh eyes in our own situation, because it's not you, but you are just saying, what am I taking from others? Quoting from Pope Francis, he said that if we really believe in the abundant, free working of the Holy Spirit, we can learn so much from others. If it's not just about being better informed about others, but rather reaping the Spirit, what is sown in them, which is also meant to be our gift. So basically, here it's a mutual openness that you are getting something from others, not you giving to others. So basically, if we have that kind of approach, we'll definitely one day reach visible unity. Okay, going maybe to the second point, that one was beside, is the issue of involvement of youths in our ecumenical movement. You know, this has been a challenge ever since the inception of the ecumenical movement. But if I take you back to the history of the modern ecumenical movement in Edinburgh, 1910, one of the most influential persons there is John Mott, who was a lay person and who was relatively young, who was a leader of the Young Men's Christian Association and the World Student Christian Federal. He was so influential there. Yet, if we look right now, we see, even if we take statistics right now on the people on the platform, I don't know maybe who are there or not, you may see that young people, there are few young people which are there. Like next year, there's going to be a general assembly from World Council of Churches. They opened up an invitation for stewardship. They wanted 160 youths. From my church in Zimbabwe, we recommended 3. World Council of Churches, they have 350. member churches. So for me, I was saying, if we are lucky, we're going to get only one person can all have the opportunity to be there. Guess what? All of the three, they were taken. So to my side is like, what kinds of churches? They have 350 member churches, but how come one rescues you? So something there might be wrong there. So what I'm saying is, as we go forward, we need the young people on the board. They need to be involved. With all due respect, if you discuss about ecumenical movement with the elderly people, they always tell you that they started when they were young, how they were involved, who were doing this when they were young. But right now, the young people, what's happening? Is it that they have no confidence on the young people, or the young people these days, they are not that compatible? I don't know, maybe it's something that we can discuss further. But I would like to appreciate the organizers for having this kind of platform. So it's something that which is needed at all levels, that the young people, they should always constantly being involved in the programs. So this is something that we should take forward, that let's groom young people, let's send them for program, let's see that they take something from us and you always continue to benefit. The last thing that I want to take your mind to is some things that we can take from some key documents that we can learn from. So the first document that I want just to point us is in Ecumenical Vandemecum, is a document produced by the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity. There's a first point that I want to draw from there is the issue of spiritual ecumenism. There, yes, we know that it's mainly is the issue of praying for Christian unity. Maybe it involves the issue of prayer week and everything. But there's something which is there that I want to read. It says there's an idea of holiness. It says all faithful should remember that the more effort that they live holier life according to the gospel, the better they further Christian unity and put into practice. So spiritual ecumenism is very key according to the document. Then also there's the pastoral ecumenism, which is the more like when the pastors or the ecclesial people, they discuss their problems. This is not really a genuine desire for unity, but discussing and sharing opinions, it really helps a lot. That and it cultivates a good ground for discussion. And it reduces all the tensions when people from different churches, they meet and they discuss all the challenges. The other third thing, which is pointed out, is cultural ecumenism. Very often, theological disagreements stem from difficulties of mutual understanding arising from cultural differences. Once communities have separated and lived in isolation from one another, cultural difference tend to widen and reinforce theological disagreement. So if you go to the whole history, you see that cultural elements have always been parcel of all these things. So cultural ecumenism includes all efforts to better understand the culture of the other Christians, and in so doing to realize beyond the culture, to vary in disagreement, we have the same faith and expressed in different ways. So we are saying we are having unity in diversity, depending on different elements. So cultural ecumenism is one of the key issues. The other point, which is practical ecumenism or ecumenism of service or of action, which is more of the issue of cooperation with Christians, are cooperating and so on. I take you back to the early 1920s of Archbishop Nathan Deplo, he said, doctrine divides and service unites. The more that people, they talk, when we start to say about doctrinal issues, it's not that we are not supposed to talk about them, but if we say let's do service, we'll always be united. So let me take you on the last segment, maybe some of the key issues that we can pick from what kinds of churches documents or from Faith and Order. There's a document called Come and See, a theological invitation to the pilgrimage of justice and peace, published in 2019. This document says that there is no, like all of us, we agree or somehow that there is the issue of injustice, violence, and a lot of people living in poverty and so many things which degrades to life in itself. So it's a call that as churches is something that we can take going forward, that we all stand together and we all participate in issues of which has to do with justice and peace. So this is like, it touches the reality of humanity, which are those challenges. The other thing that is there is about our culture, like the other document is cultivating and care, an ecumenical theology for justice for and within creation. I think creation has been misused and faces threats to balancement of life, growing of ecological crisis and effects of climate change and everything. And there is urgent environmental concerns. So the document calls the cooperation in that sphere, that as we go forward as churches and as different people, we can have unity and cooperation there. Last but not least, the document, love and witness, proclaiming the peace of the Lord Jesus Christ in a religious plural world, which was produced 2020. With no doubt, we are living in a more plural society with different religions and everything. And how do we witness Christ in those kind of areas? So basically, these are the three main issues that I want us to take from. The issue of methodology, which our doctor have already said, the issue of involvement of youths, and also some key highlights that we see from these various documents. I thank you.
Thank you, Evans, very much indeed. A huge amount of material to discuss and indeed some challenges there for us. Thank you. I'm now delighted to introduce Mrs. Theodora Mavridou, who is a member of the Church of Greece and completed her bachelor's and master's studies at the Faculty of Theology in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. She is currently a PhD candidate in that faculty in practical theology with a specialization in homiletics. Between 2017 and 2019, she was a research student at Heidelberg, and for the winter semester of the academic year 2020-21, attended the program for the Certificate of Advanced Studies in Ecumenical Studies, a joint program of the Autonomous Faculty of Protestant Theology of the University of Geneva and the Ecumenical Institute of Bossey. Theodora, thank you.
Thank you very much as well from my side for the invitation. And I would also really thank the colleagues for their presentations. Unfortunately, what I did was to concentrate more on one topic, and that came with the discussion that we had in our first meeting. So I will take you to a journey through the ecumenical movement and the women that they had to do in that. So the ecumenical work among women started long before the World Council of Churches, and I'm referring to the World Council of Churches because it's the biggest institute that when we are referring to ecumenical movement today. Women came together, they formed the Young Women's Christian Association in the late years of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, this was formed in a global movement of women, the World Young Women's Christian Association. And that one, when there was the need of a study on the status and role of the women in the church. And the women from the World Association, they had the opportunity to come in a discussion with the church leaders that were in Geneva. They came together to talk before the birth of WCC in order to discuss with them the future of that study. And the church leaders asked them to continue with that since they saw the logic in their proposal. So in order to plan for the women's participation in the first General Assembly, there was a meeting of women near Amsterdam. And the report, the band report that came after this pre-assembly was presented to the first assembly of the WCC. In the 1949, the Central Committee of WCC set up an official commission on the life and work of women in the church. And according to the first General Secretary of WCC, the significance of this commission must be regarded in the light of the ecumenical movement, which seeks to restore the wholeness of the churches and to work for its renewal. Unless women are given more responsibility in the life of local churches, that renewal cannot be achieved. I'll quote his words. In the Evanston Assembly in 1954, was accepted that this commission should be transformed to a WCC department. And that's how we got the Department of Cooperation of Men and Women in Church and Society. And because the World Council of Churches is situated in Geneva, that gave the opportunity also to women to participate in United Nations instruments, such as the World Health Organization and the International Labour Office. The women's program after the Third General Assembly responded to concerns that had to do with family, marriage, and problems in relationships. But at the Fourth Assembly in Uppsala, a shift in the focus of work and the new organization of the work was inspired. In that agenda were issued topics such as sexism, racism, poverty, and the legal rights of the women. And that is when we have Brigalia Bam, a South African theologian who was part of the anti-apartheid movement. And she introduced the importance of the political freedom as well, a problem who was experienced by many women and also men in the global South. Priority for BAM was the leadership training for women and the importance that the women could approach theology with their everyday experiences. Some years later, in Berlin in 1974, we have the Conference on Sexism in the 70s, a word sexism that, according to the then vice moderator of the WCC Central Committee, was a new word coming to the ecumenical movement. The result is that the conference in Berlin opened the way to set the role and the status of women in the ecumenical movement and in the church. And among others, in this conference, there were also touched issues such as liberation of women, justice and peace, human rights, and nuclear expansion. We see that the topics were not centered only in women, but they expanded more as far as men and nature had to do. There was also a call to the churches to ensure that women will be in decision-making bodies of the church. And this conference was of high importance because they tried to include worries and struggles of women in all societies. Later on in the Fifth General Assembly in Nairobi, after the reports of the Berlin conference, it was decided the just participation of women in the political, economic, ecclesial areas of life and decision-making bodies of the WCC. And later, 1 year later, we have the study process on the community of women and men, which was launched as a project of the Faith and Order Commission. And the methodology that was used in that study had such an impact on the Faith and Order Commission that later on in a study, there was a chapter with the title Unity and Renewal in the community of women and men. In 1981, in a world conference in the UK in Sheffield, more than 200 women and men came together to discuss the findings of the study process. The women of the Global South expressed their concern that the study wasn't responding to their contextual human concerns, such as the recognition of the oppression of racism, classism, and sexism. And that led to the 1994 establishment of the Women and Rural Development Fund in order to support survival initiatives of women. That fund was described as an attempt to deal with inequalities within the world. In 1998, we have the reconstruction of the work on women and economic justice in order to provide a feminist critique of economic structures and to explore feminist alternatives. And this is how we have now in our hands the program Agape, the alternative globalization addressing people and earth. It's a really interesting program, and the study as well, which I had the possibility and the ability to study during my master program, because in that one, the responsible, Athena Peralta, who is still working in the WCC, she was responsible for the work And through a number of discussion groups, dialogues, and visits, women were raising challenging questions as far as the impact of the world economy to the lives of the women. And as a follow-up to that program, we have in Porto Alegre in 2006, the WCC initiated a program focused on eradicating poverty. And it was understanding goals as poverty, wealth, and ecology that were integrally related to each other. To take you back, in 1981, the Central Committee of the WCC, which met in Dresden, decided, after much debate, that the principle of equal participation of women and men should be a goal towards we move, starting with the composition of the WCC decision-making and consultative bodies during and after the Sixth Assembly. The then program, called Women's Subunit, was in charge to monitor that the women during the assembly were fully participating and had voice. And official church delegates raised from 22% that we had in Nairobi to 30% in Vancouver. And for the first time, there was a woman, Pauline Webb, who was preaching at the opening ceremony. In 1987, we have the Ecumenical Decade of the Churches in Solidarity with Women, 1988 to 1999, which was an idea that emerged from the United Nations Decade on Women that had opened in 1985. Sorry. It was a decade that the community of women and men in the churches would focus attention on women and their leadership and participation in church and society. But rather than being a decade of churches in solidarity with women, it was steadily becoming a decade of women in solidarity with women, or of women in solidarity with the churches. And that wasn't received as a negative outcome, but the expectations were so high on this decade, but they were unfortunately unfulfilled. Later on in 1997, we have the report of Living Letters, a research of ecumenical teams who visited churches all over the world. In Living Letters are documented the struggles that women were facing, such as violence, lack of participation in the life of the churches, racism, and economic injustice. With that history, with that travel in the history, in the ecumenical movement, what I wanted to point out and what I wish that will change in the near future is that in all these historical facts, we see the agony of the women to be heard, and that was expressed long before the birth of the World Council of Churches. Women who might have seemed totally different from a first sight because of their different origins came together, sat next to each other, just to realize that in some cases they were facing problems in their everyday life, but they also became aware of what others were struggling with. The challenges that women were facing and are still facing are various and sometimes difficult to bear with, as it is women that are often ignored. Even women who have played leadership roles in WCC have shared their struggles to be considered as equal partners in a common ministry. The fact that even today, the World Council of Churches is still working on promoting and building a culture with no discrimination against women in church and society, I think that speaks for itself. And unfortunately, this discrimination is not only against women, but we also have another groups of people, such as the network that WCC established on Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network. I mean, there are still that are not heard equally, just like others. So I think my hope and my dream is that in the near future, this might change and people will have the position that they deserve in society and in church as well. Because there are also cases that both that I mentioned, both women, but also people with disabilities, they are not equally treated, or sometimes they are not also accepted from the church. And I think that this is something that we should also take into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theodora, very much indeed. It's so helpful to have something of the timeline of some of this conversation, whilst also to be reminded so clearly of the challenges of inclusion and diversity, which really need to be right at the centre of the Church's life. Our final panellist tonight is the Reverend Kirsty Borthwick, who is a transitional deacon in the Church of England, serving a title at the Church of All Saints Leighton Buzzard in the Diocese of St Albans. Kirsty has recently submitted her PhD to Cambridge, which examines prayer through the lens of St Augustine's Trinitarian theology, and her doctoral defence is tomorrow. So we are immensely grateful to Kirsty for being with us tonight, and hope that this is both preparation and, as it were, solace and solidarity in these final stages of the journey. As part of Kirsty's final year at Theological College, she spent a term at the Ecumenical Institute at Bossey, and is now very committed to exploring how ecumenical work might factor into her future ministry. Kirsty, thank you.
Thank you very much, and for the best wishes tomorrow. I really appreciate that. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here and for gathering us for this kind of conversation. I think it's really important. Alongside the formal barriers to full communion, so questions of doctrine, attitudes to mission, recognition of ministries, and questions of moral discernment, there's the more fundamental question of how we treat one another, how we engage in dialogue, how we speak of the other within our own communities when no one else is listening, the ways in which with one hand we honour one another's traditions and with the other caricature and mock. We have to confront the ways that we're getting things wrong. And to do that, we're going to have to dig deeper and deeper into our vulnerabilities. In my time in ecumenical spaces thus far, it's been the vulnerable moments that have been the most fruitful. Vulnerability asks us to trust one another, yes, but it's also only in the willingness to be vulnerable that real trust can ever really be forged. And with it, the sort of fellowship that leads not just to sharing space, but an enriching of koinonia. And in that vulnerability, if we truly hope to break bread together one day in remembrance of the crucified and risen Christ and in anticipation of the supper of the Lamb, to inhabit his wounded and glorified body, we need together to face our own wounds, personal and communal, in the sure and certain hope that the Spirit yearns to hold our wounds in the wounds of Christ and to heal them in his body. And so in the spirit of Christ's call to do this, to break bread in remembrance of him, and inspired by recent work, but with an eye to the future, I'm particularly drawn to the healing of memories, both privately and formally. Dr. Hawkey spoke at the beginning of today's webinar of an ecumenical winter. Perhaps we need to lean into the challenge of a harder season and allow it to bear us into a new spring. There's rich precedent for this work. Last year, Protestants in Germany marked the 75th anniversary of the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, an act of confession in 1945 of the Church's complicity in Nazi oppression, and an act which facilitated the reconciliation which had to happen to restore friendships formed before World War II, ecclesial friendships that were vital in establishing the World Council of Churches in 1948. Again in Stuttgart in 2010, at their 10th assembly, the Lutheran World Federation voted to initiate a formal act of reconciliation with the Mennonites, having recognised the pain dredged up by their recent 450th anniversary celebrations of the Augsburg Confession and its harsh attack on the Mennonite community. The 5-year dialogue that led to this point of healing in Stuttgart, a dialogue which was entitled Healing Memories, Reconciled in Christ, culminated in a profound act of repentance on the part of the Lutheran participants and forgiveness on the part of the Mennonite participants. In acts of prayer and liturgy, the two communities acknowledged one another, honoured the pain of the past and its influence on the present, and sought to work for reconciliation. The then president of the Lutheran World Federation, Bishop Mark Hansen, described this act of forgiveness, followed by an act of reconciliation, as, and I quote him here, not something we just talk about, but something we do. To embrace the Mennonite leaders and to be embraced by them was to be embraced by God's grace. More recently, just last month, the Church of Sweden made formal steps in its route to reconciliation with the Sami people, apologising for its colonial past. There's a precedent here for my own church, the Church of England, to take seriously in its engagement with the Anglican communion at large and with other churches in the UK and even within our own congregations. I'm reminded too of the fruitful friendship and dialogue that's emerged between Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches in recent years, thanks to the shared membership in the WCC facilitating shared space, the chance to encounter one another honestly, and to learn to trust one another's doctrine and language for its integrity over its power to divide. And I think of an image which is cherished by many in my own church, one that speaks profoundly of the hope of some future communion between the Anglican communion and the Roman Catholic Church. I'm thinking not of Archic or Iarchum, as important as they are, and instead I'm imagining with hope what the healing of memories might look like for our communion by picturing the moment in 1966 at the end of the ecumenical liturgy in St. Paul's outside the wall, when Pope Paul VI asked Archbishop Michael Ramsey to take off his ring and replaced it with one of his own. I picture the Archbishop of Canterbury weeping and embracing the Bishop of Rome. And that's where I see the healing of memories coming to the fore. The words that they'd spoken earlier obviously mattered. The declaration they'd shared in mattered. But this act spoke of a far higher healing than I think those words could. Last year, I had the opportunity to study alongside Evans and Theodora at the Ecumenical Institute in Bossé. We made ourselves vulnerable to be there. The vulnerability of study in a new language, the vulnerability of a space where our ministries could not be fully recognised by each other because of our ecclesial home or our gender, the vulnerability of a term study right in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic, the vulnerability of being out of our depth against far more experienced peers. All of us had to leave our homes, leave our comfort zones, and enter into profound trust of one another. And it wasn't always easy. We hurt each other as much as we celebrated each other, and we cried and laughed in equal measure. But we learned to love each other in the hands of the God who loves us. Each of us gathered here will have our own wounds to bear and our sins of which to repent. I thoroughly believe the ecumenical task calls us in love to name those hurts and to hear the pain we've caused spoken back to us. Personal pain and the pain of our communities and communions. Wounds inflicted by ourselves and by our churches. Wounds that gape in us, that speak of betrayal and suffering and death. Wounds which echo the wounds of Christ. This would mean leaning into the hardest aspects of our ecumenical work, but a commitment to healing of memories may in time forge friendship and encourage long-term reconciliation. In order to be reconciled with one another, we need to trust one another with our pain, to confront together what it is that divides us, not just doctrinally, but emotionally. So may God grant us the grace for that work. That's where I hope to see us go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty, very, very much indeed. It strikes me listening to you that maybe one of the things we might lean into is so close to the heart of the Paschal mystery, the Lord's own betrayal, the Lord's own, as it were, woundedness at being pushed away by his friends, right at the moment that he's giving himself for them. Friends, we've had 4 extraordinary, rich presentations. I have questions for all of them, but largely because I want to hear them say more. But at this point, I'm going to ask them whether they have any questions or comments for each other. And simply by means of managing this rather peculiar online form of koinonia, I'm going to do this in order of presentation. So I'm going to first ask Doriana whether you have any questions or observations for your colleagues.
Thank you. I feel I agree with Kirsty. Yes, the healing of memories is especially important, and the notion of trust, because I feel that sometimes they are taken for granted in the sense that, all right, they are bypassed in order to discuss doctrinal matters, which we are not, of course, ignoring. But I think this links very well with understanding humanity, even the psychological perspective of dealing with the wound. Otherwise, the wound would fester. So that's very important, because sometimes maybe an identity of a tradition might come about as being victimized at the hand of the other tradition. And I think we need to deal with that first in order to pursue forth. Thank you very much. I mean, all the presentations were very interesting, so we see a variety. And it's very good to come together because you learn so much from the others. I feel that is a great opportunity for me. Thank you again.
This is already a really rich harvest. Kirsty, do you have anything in response?
Just to say that equally really helpful hearing you speak about humility, because I think that's what goes in hand with this. None of us wants to go into an ecumenical conversation boldly proclaiming we're the one in the right and the other person is wrong. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we do that more than we like to admit. And actually the humility to admit that we might be the ones that are wrong. I think, and to actually have that conversation rather than just do that within one's own head. I think that builds trust. The admitting where we find it difficult as much as, the bits we enjoy of ecumenical encounter.
Thank you very much. Can I now please ask Ivans whether you have any questions or comments for your fellow panelists?
Okay, yeah. Okay, no, let me start with maybe Kirsty it was nice listening to her and also bringing another perspective, which is the issue of healing of memories as we go forward. It's I think in one way or the other, they are either in church or so we have hurt one another. So it's actually something that we should take seriously to try to, like what she says, that it's not only doctrine which divides us, but also emotionally, such kind of things. And it reminds me when we were at school in Bose, I gave a name that I used to call a colonizer. It's something that I used to joke with there, but I was happy when she talked about the colonial past, how people can heal memories going forward. That's another issue. But for me, I wasn't talking seriously, but I was just joking with her there. Maybe also coming to the presentation of Theodora, which is a rich presentation as well. Yeah, I think the issue of participation of women, it's one of the challenging issues. Because I think maybe one of the issues which may be underlining is maybe how the church view women in their own churches, starting to go that. Because first of all, if we are talking of women in leadership role, especially in ecumenical circles, it goes to the issue, what role do they have in their own churches? Like right now, we can see that they might challenge even in their seminaries. If you go to seminary, because how many women do you see in seminaries or who are being trained? So basically, you see that there's a less number. So when they go out there, there's also that also to fit in there, having more high percentage. But I hope and trust that one day maybe the number can increase, maybe from the 30% which you highlighted here, which was here. For Dr. Durana, no, I don't have anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Theodora whether she wants to respond to any of that?
Well, yeah, about Ivan's comment. About the leadership of women in their churches. I mean, for sure, I cannot say about what kind of leadership can women have in the Roman Catholic Church or in the Orthodox Church, because this is how these traditions are founded. This is how they are working. I mean, it's impossible to be leaders in their churches. But what would have been the best is that these women can be heard, to be more elected in order to be delegates in meetings such as in the World Council of Churches or in other ecumenical institutions or communities. But yeah, as far as the seminaries that you were saying, I don't know how the seminary is working, but at least in my faculty, I can tell you for sure that most percentage we were women, even though we cannot be priests, but we are trained to become teachers as far as theology is concerned, to teach in the school, religion. And I would rather say that also with the feministic movement, there were also changes in Greece as well. You see that we also had a lot of women professors. I mean, my professor in homiletics was Frau was a woman. And, you know, it's difficult for some men to understand it, to get it, because, you know, in our church, women are not the ones who are preaching. So they couldn't accept a woman to be teacher in homiletics. But, you know, it's something like, I'm not going to preach in the church, but I'm going to teach you how to do it. And this leadership is coming time after time also in the politics as well. I mean, unfortunately, we are in 2021, but we still need work for women to come more in higher positions. But yeah, I don't know if I covered you.
Thank you, Theodora, very much. And can I now ask you whether you have any questions or comments for your fellow panelists?
Yeah. I really like the way that everybody introduced their topic. I think that, yeah, if I now, after the presentations, I would have done mine different as well, but it's okay, I guess. I just wanted to stay to the point that since Dr. Dorian started talking about humility, and then we heard Evans talking about people that are called not to teach you what I know, but I'm here so that I will learn from you. And then last but not least, Kirsty. Kirsty somehow always speaks in my heart. I don't know, she's one of these people that every time I hear, I don't know, it's magic. Talking about healing of memories. So you see that somehow all these are coming together. I mean, we are talking about the same things, but in different words. And I think that everybody who is dealing with ecumenical movement should have this humility in their mind, because that we need to put our egos behind. Because if we go forward with our egos, then we will never try to achieve anything. Like, you have to be, to have this humility so that you will wait for the other to say, what does he have to say? How can I come with him or her? How are our roads crossing somehow? And yeah, I don't know. This is what I tried, at least I tried to do every time that I had to do with people coming from other traditions. But, you know, sometimes it's something that you also have to do within your church as well, or within your home as well. It's something that everybody needs to, you know, to work with it. Everybody needs to work with himself, go back a little bit behind to what Jesus taught us, to what is written in the Bible. I know that the societies are totally different, so there might be things that we might have difficulties to practice in our life today, but this is how, in my mind, how we should go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's immeasurably important. I mean, one of the things that ecumenists have to teach their own churches is a sort of ecumenism of ethics, how to treat one another. As you say, what is the disposition of our conversation with each other, and what are the implications of that disposition? Thank you. I'm just going to pause because Doriana has a hand up. I wonder whether you're wanting to respond to anything that's just recently been said.
Yes, I wanted to react to Theodora's comments, yes, about women and lecturing, because I lecture in the liturgy and also in homiletics. And what I have come to understand is, rather than looking at, you know, certain reactions, because you know, they might see people, some particular people, because I don't like to generalize, might see women in particular positions. I like to try, maybe in humility, I need to practice that a lot, to go beyond categories of people and look at what makes us common. So, because sometimes the principles in ecumenism also not work, but exist also within our own tradition. So sometimes we see the other as different, as a threat maybe, But I think we need to work on our common ground. So what I can contribute to help people, to help future priests, for example. And I try to see myself not as being seen in a particular way, but I want to look at the common ground and be going, maybe, although it is difficult, beyond being man and woman, rather to what unites us, even within our known tradition, as being Christian first and foremost, rather than looking at our contributions, rather than looking at the differences which might pit us against each other because we are male and female. So that was very interesting conversation, Theodora. I liked your, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Would any of the panel, whilst we're on this particular topic, like to respond to anything that either Theodora or Doriana has said in those interventions, either Kirsty or Ivans? In which case, I'll go to Kirsty to ask whether you have any questions or comments for your fellow panelists.
Thank you. Other than the comment about humility on Dorian's paper that I had the opportunity to mention earlier, I just wanted to say thank you to Ivans for raising the question of spiritual ecumenism, partly because prayer is my thing. It's what I've been writing on for the last 4 years, but also because actually one of the deepest pains from the kind of the 5 months that I spent at Bosse was not being able to call what we did in the morning in chapel worship, because that word was not appropriate in an ecumenical setting. And I can't, I don't know, it's strange that it's that hurt perhaps more than anything else. And so we're at our most vulnerable in prayer. Prayer is when we're our most human. And it's when God can perhaps be most at work in us. And so kind of the courage to be really bold in the way that we pray together. And I was particularly struck by the vulnerabilities that some of our Orthodox siblings put themselves into by joining us in those prayers. The real risk of getting in quite serious trouble for praying with us, and a kind of how much that meant for that risk to be taken. So yeah, thank you to Ivans for raising that, because I think it's an issue that we kind of tiptoe around quite a bit, but we need to kind of face head on.
I completely agree. And if I could echo that, thanks, because if the theologian is firstly one who prays, then actually if there can't be a sense of being able to pray together, then what is the, as it were, the basis of our relationship? Thank you all very, very much indeed. Now, again, I have lots of questions that I'm dying to ask, but I don't want to hog the chair, some would say uncharacteristically. So can I ask you, if you, we're opening it now to the floor, if you have a question or indeed an aspect of the conversation you simply want to raise, please use the raising hand function on Zoom, or indeed type your question into the chat. Somebody's already written, Chris, thank you, Kirsty, for getting through to issues of the heart and beyond the head. So the first question that I can see here is from Bishop Michael Burrows in Ireland. And he asks, have the visionary speakers any prophetic word to say to the many contexts, including his own country, where ecumenical convergence is often confused with the compromising of political identity? Who would like to seize that one? I'm not going to do the thing that they do on the British program Newsnight, which is to name somebody to respond, because that's deeply unfair. But this important question about what happens when you confuse ecumenical rapprochement with the compromising of political identity.
Can I answer?
Please do.
I feel that maybe sometimes we tend to forget even the role of formation, because why does confusion happen? Sometimes even fear in ecumenism, apart from the confusion, yes, mentioned, which might be a very great reality. But I think that is where formation comes in. So we need to distinguish between what is pertinent to the spiritual aspect in doing ecumenism and other aspects, such as the political scene. And I think, yes, formation is very important. Maybe sometimes that is taken for granted, but I feel that is part and parcel of doing ecumenism, going beyond what we know in order to venture into the different, because otherwise it would be easy to confuse things. So I feel, yes, formation is crucial.
I'm sure that's right. Formation completely crucial. I also wonder if there's something which we might need to relearn ecumenically, and that is about the fundamental importance of common baptism. That already we are one. I mean, that's the beginning in a sense. But anyway, sorry, Kirsty, you want to come in here?
Yeah, just given the kind of reference to Ireland and my proximity with being in England, it strikes me that whilst a lot of these questions can feel quite internal, so, you know, take Northern Ireland, for instance, and the ecumenical history there that's located in a specific geographical place, but of course, which is shaped heavily by the influence of my own country and its influence, or England in particular, and its influence historically. And so just the care in which these conversations needs to happen, which includes all parties that have been involved. And again, the willingness to admit kind of historical influence and fault where that needs to be admitted. And so often these kind of political and ecumenical conversations can feel like they're happening amongst the parties who are most closely linked in one given place or kind of situation, when actually there are parties beyond that who, stepping in is not quite the right word, because I think that's probably what's gone wrong in the past, but kind of involvement and honest listening beyond the kind of specifics of the conversation, the parties in the conversation. Yeah, that's not very articulate, but I hope you know what I mean.
It's extremely articulate. Thank you very much indeed. Please, friends, keep the questions coming. Don't not write a question or not raise your hand just because somebody else is speaking. Please do keep them coming if you have questions to ask. Another question has just come in from Neil Vigers. To all our panelists, what future liturgical act of reconciliation would give you the greatest joy? What future liturgical act of reconciliation would give you the greatest joy? Who'd like to come in here?
Well, I know I just spoke, but this is a really simple one. So I'm celebrating the Eucharist, hopefully for the first time in kind of half a year's time after my ordination to the priesthood. And having ecumenical friends there and involved in any small way actually is the next thing that I'm hoping for. And I think the personal and the local matters just as much as the international.
Absolutely. There is, as it were, one Eucharist. Yeah. Would any of our other panelists like to make any comment on that question? What future liturgical act of reconciliation would give you the greatest joy?
I agree with Kirsty, because I think that is our aim. It is a ratification of our unity, I feel. Celebration of the Eucharist, partaking of the Eucharist is a ratification of the unity. So I feel, yes, that is very important. And that is the ultimate, I feel, as I said, show of unity. And, you know, we have accepted the other, and we are participating, we are members of the Church of Christ. And its holistic aspect, and its fullest aspect. Because it is the Eucharist which sustains us and nourishes us, and it will be nourishing us as a whole community.
Okay, let me just add on to what the two panelists have said. I think it's like through the bilateral dialogues and the multilateral dialogues, I think some churches, they have now come to be in fellowship with one another. But I think the one sensitive issue which has not been really solved is the issue centers on the Eucharist. Others, there's now maybe issue of recognition of baptism, recognition of ministries and everything. But even with the Catholics and the Orthodox and I think the main attention or the main thing has to do with the Eucharist. So I think that should be maybe if when we reach there, for me, I think I'll be happy if once somebody can be able to celebrate the Eucharist in another church.
May I also? I think that this is the most difficult question, but it's somehow the answer that everybody is waiting for. It's the Eucharist. I mean, it cannot be more obvious than that. And even though we are saying all the same, it seems though so difficult to happen of our traditions because of all the things that separate us. But I think that it's still a dream for everybody. And I don't know. We are made for the difficult ones. I tend to believe.
Can I just, as it were, push our panel here that there's a particular kind of scandal, isn't there, when the Eucharist has become a cause of our division. That which should be the greatest sign of our unity in Christ has become a cause of our division. Can I just tempt any of our panelists to comment from their own perspective, either as theologians from particular churches or as theologians simply with imaginations, just to comment on the question of where they see our current rules on Eucharistic hospitality. Should the Eucharist, as it were, to be crude about it, be food for the journey, or is it really the crowning of communion? Or is it both of those? Is it something more just fundamental, richer? Can it not be binarized in that way? I wonder if any of our participants have any thoughts on that. I think Kirsty has her hand up. Is that right?
I have something, but I don't want to keep jumping in first. So
no, go for it. Absolutely, go for it.
Your question made me think of the Church of England and the fact that I have dear friends and colleagues who won't be able to take the Eucharist from me because they're under alternative episcopal oversight. And so we are held within the same church, not even the same communion. And yet there's not quite full communion at the altar. And there's a whole question over that, but kind of that setup. And I can't quite place it, but I'm okay with that. And it's ambiguous and it doesn't really make sense and it doesn't really work. And in some ways, it's not the fullness of what Christ wants for us around the Eucharist. But there's a kind of a making do while we're on the journey that does feel like it makes sense and feels spiritually rich. And the trying to make it work feels like an act of koinonia, which is not an answer, but I think kind of there's a lot to be said in the gap between the two, I think.
There's a matter of factness in the reality of it, isn't there? Which is, especially when it's underpinned by a theology of reception, which is so important. I just want to introduce one other element into this conversation, which strikes me as being of interest. Some of you may already know the new document of the International Reformed Anglican Dialogue, which is on koinonia, and one of the most important insights of that document is, well, it's a challenge to the churches. Can we articulate a theology of communion which is strong enough to stop disagreement dividing? So is koinonia primary to everything we have ever said about one another? That if communion is gift, it's never ours to break. So the very language of being in and out is possibly the wrong kind of language. I don't know in this conversation whether that resonates with any of our speakers. If not, I shall move straight on to more questions because my chat box is filling up. Why don't we move on? We can always come back to this topic in a little while. So I have here, sorry, I'm just scrolling through some comments, some questions. So I'm going to ask a question from Hector Seri, which is in two parts. The first question: how do you gauge the impact upon the grassroots of prophetic ecumenical gestures? It's a question about impact of ecumenical gestures, how you gauge that, how it's landing with the grassroots of our churches. Second question: what do you think of the effect one day of acknowledging our respective lists of martyrs? What about the publication of a common list of martyrs as part of our ecumenical journey? Of course, the monastery of Beauvais, the ecumenical monastery of Beauvais in the north of Italy already has an ecumenical martyrology, but I think it's a very, very important point. Can we just focus perhaps on the first one of those? How do you gauge the impact on the grassroots? Which of our panel would like to take that one up?
Can I take?
Please do.
I think it is very important. The ecumenical gestures we witness are very important. But we also have to take into account not just the hierarchical aspect, as we mentioned earlier, but sometimes we might be oblivious to what is grassroots. So I think it has the ecumenical perspective must be both horizontal and vertical, in the sense that we must take stock of what is happening around us, the various examples of ecumenical gestures which are happening among people. So sometimes I am surprised by people even helping each other, even in aspects which might not be so of a doctrinal aspect in matters. And I think that is also giving an example of a certain kind of unity, of a certain kind of movement towards unity. So while we look at our church leaders, we have countless. I feel blessed to have so many examples of church leaders from different traditions who show these aspects of humility and also seek response from the other traditions in order for healing of memories, and in order, for example, we take Utunum Sint, for example, we take examples Pope Francis. And so we must not forget what is happening at the grassroots. So I think that both aspects serve as nourishment for each other in order to further cement and sustain each tradition and cement the link between the churches and traditions.
Thank you very much. I wonder if in this context I could tempt Ivans into saying a bit more about what he was encouraging us to consider in how our churches engage with younger Christians in this passion for ecumenism. Because, of course, where things land with the grassroots, it's a particular challenge with younger people, isn't it? Do you have any advice for us, Ivans, as to how we can, as it were, fuel young Christians' passion for this work?
Yeah, I think like the issue of dealing with the people like the grassroots, and I think what kinds of churches, they published a document Together Towards Life, which talks about mission from the margins. You know, having the idea that in every society there are the people in the margins, normally who are somewhere there. And in which context, this context, I would like to take maybe the grassroots people, or maybe the youths that who are not like the ecumenical movement is more like hierarchical, that is only the people, the elite people always talk. So basically we all, I don't know, here in Africa, we always say like the youth are the future of tomorrow. So basically taking the youth along the way, like involving them in programs, sending them to other ecumenical programs, like the grassroots people, they should know what's happening up there. If there are like documents which are published, to try to make them that they reach them, they know such kind of programs, and to just have them on the journey that to try to fill in the gap, so that in the near future they can take over. Like I highlighted, like John Mott, when he started, he was a lay person, but he was very influential. So we need those kind of people that we will try to bridge, who are not even ordained, but who are also influential on the way.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on because we have a couple more questions and I want to try and get through as many as we can before we have to close. Priscilla Chadwick makes the point that we have a common baptism. The question is, when can we have a common confirmation, so that young people are brought up to value ecumenism and not forced to choose which denomination to sign up to? How does that land with our speakers? The possibility of a common confirmation. If baptism is, as it were, the source of our sacramental life.
I can make a brief comment, but
Thank
I'll
you.
go first again. If
No, please do.
To put it bluntly, in my own context, I think we need to get away from second baptisms as part of this conversation. We do recognise each other's baptisms formally, but actually, I was very tempted into being baptised again because of a move of churches. In fact, I just moved within kind of traditions within the Church of England. I hadn't even moved churches, and it could have happened very easily with no one noticing. So I'd love something like a common confirmation. I guess there's kind of issues around that being a thing in some traditions and not others. But I think part of this question is engaging with the fact that actually people do rebaptize, and we need to confront that as an honest truth. It's still happening, I think. or we can.
Thank you very much. Have any of our other panelists got anything to say on this topic? I saw Dr. Will Adams' hand up. I wonder whether it was a comment on this topic, Will, particularly.
Yeah, Jamie, thank you for this. Some years ago in England, there were rites approved by, ecumenically for a common service of confirmation, which involved prayer with laying on of hands by ministers, competent ministers from different churches that were part, and it was only to be used in in local ecumenical partnerships. And what that enabled is it enabled a kind of, if you like, a joint membership in a place where there was a joint worshipping community. But the point was, as the questioner has said, once you left, if you left and moved on somewhere else, you then really did need to join up to wherever you landed in your next place. But it did enable people to be, say, United Reformed Church, Church of England, Methodist, whatever. So thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the really big challenges, how do we read what is going on in local realities into a broader context of a common life? The half hour is approaching, but I want to ask one final question, which I think actually will leave us in what I suspect will be a very important place. Sebastian Mensa's question: how can the ecumenical movement find the necessary courage to face today's challenging ethical struggles that divide churches even in themselves, sometimes more than questions of doctrine, instead of tiptoeing around those issues and never acknowledging them? So it's a question about how the ecumenical movement finds the necessary courage to face today's ethical struggles that divide particular churches themselves. Which of our panel might like to have a word on this one?
Can I attempt a reflection rather than a response?
Please do.
Sometimes, certain responses may take a long time in common because reflection is key. And I feel that some struggles here, some ethical issues, in a way, ironically speaking, might appear as a way of uniting the churches together, in the sense of, since certain issues are common to all traditions, I feel, it might be a way of uniting the churches and trying to come to an understanding and solution, but dealing with these situations, with these issues which arise, because in a way, certain issues permeate the same aspects in all traditions. Of course, as you said, it's a very complex issue because this is sometimes dividing people within traditions. I see it happening in Malta, for example, certain aspects, certain ethical issues. For example, in Malta, the issue of abortion, for example, although Malta is deemed as a very Catholic country, but in reality, there is more pluralism than one can acknowledge. And also when it comes to diverse opinions, also when it comes to helping young people to discussing these aspects with them. So I acknowledge that this is a very complex issue within one tradition, but it might also be it might propel churches forward, traditions forward, in order to try and discuss. I am aware that this might take a long time. This dialogue might take a long time. Maybe the part of the problem is that we have no patience as well. But I think this would enable us to gain trust in each other as we realize that what unites us is greater than what divides us. And ironically, sometimes it is also about sort of threats, so to speak. So I acknowledge, though, that this is a very complex and very pertinent matter, because this is, yes, a very important issue, which needs, and having the courage, yes, sometimes I feel that having the courage is important, but I think we need to acknowledge and embrace the role of the Spirit more than we do in our lives before we can proceed forward in discussing these.
Thank you very much indeed. Would any other one of our panelists like to come in fairly briefly on this one?
May I?
Of course.
So before I got disconnected, I saw Sebastian's question, And I also saw somebody answered as well, commented on that. Sebastian is also one of the people who were studying all together in Posey. So while we were there, we were introduced to a number of publishments from WCC, and it was about churches and moral discernment. It was a study, and I think there were like three books. One was learning from history, one learning from traditions, and the last one was I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact title, but it was like using dialogue in order to build koinonia. I think I don't know, because it was so new when we were there. We didn't have enough time to read these books as well, but I think that somehow this is how we are supposed to do, like learning from the mistakes that we did in the history and try somehow to heal these memories, as Kirsty said. Try to learn from traditions, like to take how is it possible, whether is it possible to take to try to combine traditions in order to build somehow later this community, like to try to come together with each other, but in a way so that we will not lose our identity as well, because I think that this is also important, coming together but somehow trying to bring our own stigma in this koinonia, so that we will show who we are, but try also to be one together.
Thank you very much indeed. Bishop Bruce Myers of Quebec has put a link in the chat to those documents. And of course, there's also the forthcoming ARCIC work on moral discernment in due course. We're bang on 7:30 in London, 8:30 in Rome. So I'm just going to quickly thank all of our panelists very profoundly for an extraordinarily enriching conversation. It's been really a magnificent evening. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand over to Archbishop Jan Ernest, the director of the Anglican Centre in Rome and the personal representative of the Archbishop Canterbury of the Holy See, for his final words.
Thank you very much, Canon Orki, for, I would say, for this excellent moderation of this panel, of this online session this evening. I feel deeply impressed by the profoundness and genuineness of your respective presentations, and I feel empowered this evening, as I think that institutions like ours are important in playing a role that would bring about a fruitful future for ecumenism, especially in respect of developing a mindset where humility and generosity and trust prevail. I wish here to thank our consultant this evening for the technical aspect of our session, Mr. Esposito Neto from the Centro Pro Unione. And may I take this opportunity to wish you all a blessed time at Christmas. And now I would like to hand over to our chair, Bishop Michael Burrows, for the closing prayer.
And if I may say it also, it's been a most stimulating, enriching and rewarding evening, and we are profoundly grateful to all who took part. So I think I join with the director in his words of gratitude. Wish you all the joys of the season that is coming, and perhaps just finish with a concluding blessing, and indeed blessing of each other in the spirit of Advent. Christ, the Son of Righteousness, shine on you, gladden your hearts and scatter the darkness from before you. And the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you and remain with you all through this Advent journey from darkness to light, and always. Amen.
you.